Hello there, sword friends. This is going to be a review on a Dragon King Sakura Katana. Now, the Sakura Katana retails for about $450. I don't see it for sale right now on Cult of Athena, but I was able to find it for about $400 on a few different websites. Sometimes even a little bit lower than that, depending on where you get them, but I can never tell if they're secondhand or factory second, or if there's something wrong. So in terms of an authorized distributor, I found them for about $400, but if you find one in a cheaper price from an authorized place, throw it in the description below to help out fellow sword friends. Let's start with the Kashra. Now, the Kashra has some pros and cons to it. One, I believe this is a copper Kashra, or probably just copper Fuchi Kashra in general. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I do see some kind of orangish stuff underneath the little spot that's worn away here. However, this patina really reminds me of Shibuichi in terms of how Shibuichi looks. Shibuichi is a alloy metal that is a combination of copper and silver, and when it's patinated, it can come out with this kind of dull gray-green look. Now, there's no cherry blossom theme on it, but I think it really comes out to have a pretty clear, cool look to it, you know, without getting gaudy or stupid. Just basically, I like the way it looks. That's a subjective thing. It seems reasonably well done, and nothing on it bites into me. Even the little shitadome here have rounded edges, and there are actual little shitadome in here, which is nice, and they have a silver kind of color to them. I bet they're just nickel plated, but nevertheless, it's a nice little addition here. Now, the downside is it doesn't really transition super well here. There's no ledge on it exactly that bites in, but if you look at it from some of the off angles, it just doesn't look like it's done super well. The Ito and just how this lineup here looks a little janky, but it's not loose or anything like that, so it's overall functionally perfectly sound. I just don't like that I can see some of the panels, and it looks like it's a little thin, and that it overlaps over some of the Ito on the side spots here. I can make out the ledge of the Kashra really easy. Those are just my personal gripes. Now we can talk about the Fuchi. It has a very similar aesthetic look to it in terms of its pattern. Again, it's got this kind of dull gray, shiny look to it. There's a small ledge here that I notice as I rub my fingers on, but I didn't really have any issue in terms of using it. It held up just fine, and I didn't notice that it was wearing the skin off my fingers or anything. Looking at the handle, the first thing I can draw your attention to are these cherry blossom manuki, and they have a lot of detail. I think they're really well done. I like the nickel plating, at least that's what I'm guessing is done on them, but the amount of detail that I see in them in contrast with the plain kind of Fuchi Kashra is really quite nice. I'm aesthetically, I'm a fan. The handle itself, though, it's a pretty plain Jane thing. It doesn't feel like an axe handle. It fits well in kind of my large glove-sized hands. The Ito diamonds are really not done super well. They're a little bit uneven, but the Ito itself is serviceably tight. And when I say serviceably, that means I can move it around if I push on it really hard, but it doesn't just freely kind of wiggle around as some other swords have in the past. So it makes me think that it's comfortable enough to use, and as I did use it, it didn't come loose, and this is post-use actually, so yeah, I guess it's held up reasonably well. Now, the shape of the handle is acceptable. It's not cracked in terms of the scour. The core of the handle, I took it apart and inspected it, and it's not cracked after all of the usage that I did on it. And that's good, because I took it apart after using it. I didn't inspect it prior to use, which would probably be a smart thing to do, given that it's a used sword. But nevertheless, it's not cracked, which means from the factory it wasn't cracked either. And as surprising as it might be, in a lot of swords, even really expensive ones, the handles often come cracked underneath the wrapping and Ito. The Ito itself is actually frayed a little bit. I don't know how much this was used or not used, but that's not necessarily my favorite thing, is that in some spots you can see there's little bits of fibers kind of coming up. I can make out some of the, what are these called? These little paper bits. The word is escaping me. Hishigami, that's the word. I had to look it up. Okay, anyway, I can make out these little paper triangles that are stuck underneath the Ito in some spots. And on the base here, there's a stain. And the previous owner mentioned that this is how it actually came. It looks like there's a dab of glue or something. It's actually hard on my finger when I touch it. So I'm not exactly sure what to think about that, but nevertheless, there's a stain. And if this came on the sword, which is kind of hearsay, I didn't buy the sword new, but the owner said it was there, this stain would be something that would irk me personally. It's dark and rather noticeable. Now, moving on to the Tsuba. The Tsuba is really what I think is the highlight of the sword. And I have to admit, I'm pretty impressed with the Dragon King fittings. I've looked at a few of the other swords that they have to offer, and a lot of the fittings that they have seem on par with Hanwei, which is previously one of the few manufacturers that I think really did a pretty decent job in terms of making Tsuba, Fujikashira. I mean, whether or not they all went together in a good way is a different question, but just in terms of the individual detail that you would see on some of the cast pieces, I thought Hanwei does a great job. I still think they do. This is kind of up in that level to me. It's different. It's not the same type of Tsuba that I see on every kind of mass manufactured sword. It's got a little bit of kind of class to it, and I can make out a lot of details. It's also not overdone with gold and silver paint, trying to make it something that it really can't ever be. So just for what it is in terms of the shaping, the fact that it's three-dimensional, it's not a stamped version on one side and then on the other with this kind of flat ground edge. It's one kind of nicely cast piece. I'm really actually pretty impressed with it. It's also quite tight, and everything in terms of the whole handle assembly is pretty good. The saya is a black gloss saya, and you can see it's just littered with my fingerprints and stuff. The kurigata on here seems reasonably well painted. It's not cracked, and it has, again, these little silver shitodome, if I'm even saying that right. And I would note that they haven't popped out. Oftentimes these things, when you remove the sageo, or just in general handling, these little pieces pop out, and they actually seem reasonably well secured in here, so I have to give some props to that. Also, just the general shaping. I mean, it's a thick kind of gloss, but it's reasonably well done, and the handle holds on reasonably well. It doesn't take a ton of force to remove, but the habaki is actually secured in a way that's pretty good. And the transitions overall here, you can see they seem to line up reasonably well. There's no really big giant kind of saya that's stuck on here to be thicker, and it lines up with the Fuji in a way that seems aesthetically very pleasing, and in general the right direction for correct. The blade itself, if we go to the habaki and seppa, the habaki is silver colored, but I'm guessing it's nickel plated. Again, that's my guess. So it's a nice silver color though, and I also would note that the seppa have some kind of detailing on them, which is different anyway, and that's, like I said, I look at the same habaki all the time, and this one just gives me enough of a difference to say, it's something different. That's me. I have a bunch of swords, and most people would only have one, so that probably wouldn't be a point that would bother. But the little detail and whatnot on the seppa is a nice little touch of class. Let's talk about the blade, the pointy stabby part. And first things, just general construction. The lines on the blade are not bad. I do see some rippling and whatnot. Polish on the blade is not really anything substantial. I see the spine is kind of shiny, and then the satin finish is along the cutting plane. I don't notice any secondary bevels or anything like that. The sword is really sharp. This is done post-use as well, and there are no dings, blemishes, rolling. The edge is held up really well to testing. I believe it's a through-hardened 5160 steel blade, and 5160 is something used by a lot of manufacturers to make swords. I think a lot of people really harp on the steel and what it is and what it's made from, and I think that's honestly the wrong question to ask. If the sword manufacturer can make a good sword out of this steel, that seems to be the better question. All things being equal, the type of steel matters, but all things, frankly, aren't equal. Sometimes people use sword steels that they really don't know how to use, and you can have a really fancy super steel not do a great job in terms of what a sword is supposed to do. And other times people know how to work with the really cheap stuff because they do it so much, and they can make a really amazing sword with, the really basic steel materials. So what I can say is I don't really have any other experience with Dragon King other than this sword, but this sword has held up to what I've done. It's held an edge really well. It moves really well. It's constructed in a pretty solid fashion for its price point. So I think they did a good job with the 5160 sword, but I really haven't done a lot of abusive testing with it. So time, I guess, will be the real determining factor. But in terms of what I did, whacking the stand, doing some tatami and bottle cutting, it held up really well. No edge deformation after smacking it into the stand a few times. So I think they kind of hit the mark. Now that said, there are no real fun effects to look at here. No hamon, because it's not a differentially hardened blade. At least I don't think it is. I don't see that effect in the steel. There's no hata. It's not folded, so there's no kind of artistic characteristics in the sword other than the general shape itself. It's handsome in its own way, but at the same time it lacks some of the artistic qualities that you see in some of the other swords at higher price points. Now, in terms of how it handles dynamically, let's talk about that. Now, the sword is 2 pounds 8 ounces. Hanoi Advertised is 2 pounds 9 ounces. And the cherry blossom theme makes me think that this kind of weight and stuff would really be suitable to a female practitioner that's looking to do some target cutting. It's not super heavy. It has a theme that isn't, dongs and war and, I don't know, maybe my idea of what female practitioners like is completely incorrect because I'm a guy and I'm not a lady. But anyway, I think it looks pretty. My wife thought it looks pretty, and my daughter over there seemed to not hate it as well. Hey, Faith. Faith.
What?
Do you think this sword is pretty? Why?
Because it's red.
All right. Well, there you go. Anyway, the general aesthetics give me the idea that this is something that is at least appealing to a female practitioner. I find it appealing as well, though. The cherry blossom theme is actually really kind of cool to me. It wouldn't necessarily be my first choice, but I do find myself actually really oddly digging it now that I have it in the hand. Now, the weight distribution as well is what kind of makes me think that 2 pounds 8 ounces is not light, but it's not really heavy. The profile here is pretty thick and then tapers out. It gives it, for a stout sword or for something in its general weight, it actually feels more lively than perhaps it should. I feel reasonably connected to the point, and as I was using it, I really didn't have any problem with tip control. I didn't have a problem throwing the blade out there and stopping it. It seems reasonably well balanced in terms of how you can actually handle and control the blade, but it does feel stout. It's not a light yaito, but I wouldn't necessarily mind using this to do kata, to do iaido or anything like that. It's heavier than most of those swords are. So balance-wise, it's on the heavier side, but still feels reasonably lively if that's explaining anything. I had really no problem kind of moving it around. It was actually pretty comfortable. But when I say comfortable, it doesn't give me the impression like it's the Hanwei Shinto, which feels like an iaito that's sharp. This feels like a sword. It feels like a weapon, but at the same time, I don't really mind moving it around. And a lot of times when I have this kind of heft in my hand, it's from a big, meaty, heavy sword, and they're hard to move and hard to stop and hard to control. And I don't get that with this one. It's actually pretty comfortable. Moving it around my hand was pleasant. In terms of how it actually worked, in terms of use, I did some water bottle cutting on it, and really it was easy to move around. It's really, really sharp, and so it cut water bottles. There's not really a lot of effort that goes into cutting a water bottle, frankly, but it did a good job, and I was able to move it quickly, and it felt controllable. And I'm no great masterful cutter, but it did a good job. On tatami, it was actually a pleasant experience as well. This sword, and not necessarily being dedicated as a tatami mat cutter, it's not designed with specifically cutting big tatami grass mats as its design purpose. I mean, if you look at something like the Hanwei XL series, those are really designed with a very wide blade that's very thin. and they're designed to do very well at cutting tatami mats specifically. This one doesn't have that profile, but I found it to be a very comfortable experience in terms of cutting tatami mats. I did have to get the blade going at a good pace to make it through the mat. If I took a slower approach, if I just kind of whiffed it a little bit and tried to let the sword do the cutting, it didn't do it. It doesn't have the same mass that some of those other kind of dedicated tatami mat cutters do. So I did have to put some gusto in it, and I'm a big guy, so moving the sword there's mass just in my arms moving the blade. As I look at the footage, my technique is really lacking. I'm not doing a great job. I'm making it through the mat, but I really have to power through it. That said, when I went to do stabs and things like that, I found the sword felt very connected, and it was easy for me to land the target, which I don't do a lot of thrusting with these swords, so the fact that I actually hit what I was aiming for is pleasant. So that's, anyway, if I move on to what I think about it, do I think it's worth it? Yeah, I mean, honestly, this sword is $450 retail. You can find it for less than that. It has nice fittings. The assembly seems reasonably good, and it's sharp and feels pleasant in the hand. I like that it just has a different theme and doesn't look like everything else, but kind of blends in with everything else too. It doesn't stand out as overly dramatic or blingy or something kind of really off the norm. But at the same time, if you look at it up close, it just has some characteristics that I think are different. Now, that's not necessarily enough reason to buy it, but it's comfortable in the hand. It's not terribly expensive as far as swords go, and the construction on it seems to be acceptable. There's no major glaring issue that says this needs more work before you use it, or it has to be redone, or it's not good enough to just take out of the box and start doing whatever you're going to do. It feels comfortable enough to use if you're going to do kata or yaido or something like that, and you want a live blade to do that with. And it's also comfortable to cut with. So if any of those things are what you're looking for, then I don't think it's a bad idea. Now, keep that in mind, that if you're looking for something specifically to do a lot of kata or forms with, this is on the heavier side, and there may be other things you want to consider doing that with. Also, if you're only going to cut tatami mats or only going to cut water bottles, there's probably swords that do a better job of doing any one of those particular things. So if all you're going to do, or all you're going to cut is tatami, I don't know that I would necessarily say this is the blade that you should be getting. But if you want a reasonably well-rounded blade that you can do any one of those particular things with, something a little bit more balanced in terms of what it's capable of being used for, with some degree of effectiveness, I think this is a promising option. So anyway, it's left me with some good impressions. There are some things I don't particularly like in terms of assembly, but nothing that I would give a complete failure to. So $500 is a little bit on the higher side, but if you can find it for $350, $450, something like that, I think that's not bad. Anyway, those are my thoughts, and I hope they are reasonably helpful. That's all I have for you. As always, I'm going to stop rambling, and cheers. Thanks for watching. And I inspected the Nakago, or not the Nakago. God damn it. No, I should stop. Anyway, on with the stuff. Or habaki, not terribly obese or practitioner. This would be a more, nope, I'm not going to get there yet. I think Hanwei does a good job with it. They've made a few different style swords. Nope, this isn't a Hanwei piece though, is it? Anyway, the basic gist, nope. Well, here, if you see me swinging it around, I did a little shape of a sword. No, that's just not the right way.